Hi everyone, I'm Tim Sevenhusen. I am the creator of Oracle's Elixir and also the former director of esports analytics for 100 Thieves. I want to talk about some news that was reported recently about the Valorant rules for substitutes and the challenger scene. Something reported on BlixGG by Anonymotum. I want to talk about that change and one specific part of it, why I think it's a really good change, but I want to look at some of the things that it helps with and some of the things that it doesn't solve for. And let's just break that down a little bit. This is going off of, again, a reported change, something that hasn't been announced officially by Riot. So I'm just going to work off the details that are in the report and a little bit of extrapolation or assumption from that. So the change, just to get into a little bit, what's been reported is that for 2024, VCT teams will be able to loan players from their roster to the challengers team in their region. I assume it's within the same region, and that they would still be paying the player's salary, but that player can play on the challengers team. So, for example, 100 Thieves could have 6 players, and one of those players could be playing on a team in the challengers scene that they've made an agreement with, paying that salary. They're still getting to play, and then at some point they'd be able to call them up if needed. And in theory, you can also then switch them out with somebody who's on your starting 5. There's a note in the article that says as long as the VCT player has played fewer than 50% of the VCT games. So I guess interpreting that, if you're more than halfway through the regular season, or however that's defined, you could not then switch them out. Something like that. So there's some details in there that have to be shaken out a little bit, and that could affect, the viability of this policy. But since I don't know those details, I'm going to work off of kind of what I'm expecting, that there's some amount of flexibility to have a 6th player, or more than 6. In the article, it talks about 1 to 4 players being marked as substitutes. I don't know how many of those would be allowed to play down in challengers, but again, we're working out some assumptions here. And presumably more information will come out over time and when Riot's ready to announce these things officially. So why was a change needed? Let's talk about that first. The system in VCT this year, in 2023, was that every team is required to have at least 6 players who are eligible for the starting roster. So what's the purpose of that kind of 6th man slot or 6th player slot? There are a few purposes for it. One, and a really big one, is insurance for emergencies. If something bad happens to one of your starting players and they can't play anymore, Riot doesn't want any forfeits happening, to whatever extent they can control that. They want to have actual games they can put on, and teams want to be able to actually field a roster and compete. So if you've got a 6th player and you're not having to scramble and sign somebody if something bad does happen, the games can go on. In theory, it's meant for strategic flexibility as well, so you can move a player in and out. We saw EG switch out BCJ and bring in Demon 1. Of course, they stuck with that change, but if they'd wanted to move somebody in and out, we've seen some other teams have players coming in and out. And then the other kind of usage for it would be that you've got prospects that you've got internally you're able to promote later. That's why you're allowed to have more than 5 players. But how are VC teams actually using their 6th player slot most of the time? Well, there are a lot of reasons that teams would not be using it really for those purposes. A lot of teams would be using one of their coaches or an analyst or something like that, whoever kind of fit the minimum rank requirements. They'd be using that person as their 6th for a few reasons. One is that it saves them money. They're going to be paying this person as a coach anyways. They don't want to have to pay another player if they can avoid it, if they can get away from it, because they're watching their budgets, right? For a lot of complex reasons, a lot of teams are watching their budgets very closely right now. And that's kind of just an unavoidable part of this. Even if the budgets weren't really tight and finances were stronger, a lot of teams would be watching that budget spend anyways, because they want to make sure that the player in this slot is actually generating enough value for the money that they're spending on paying that player to sit and not play, right? This is a player who's just sitting and not playing all year. And so they have to be doing some other kind of value, and that's why they'd often have a coach or an analyst in there. Emergencies are so rare that often kind of that insurance of having another player feels unnecessary. If the chances are, 1 in 100 that you're actually going to need this player for an emergency, we only see a couple of teams a year need this for anything. CGRS was needed for PRX in Tokyo because something wasn't able to be there. Okay, great. They had some coverage for that. There are a couple other examples, MIBR at the end of the regular season, things like that. But it's pretty rare, right? And so it feels like kind of an unnecessary insurance policy to most teams. They're willing to take the risk. The strategic flexibility option, generally not worth the price of having. If you've got another player, if you've got 6 players who are good enough for your starting roster, well, why don't you just pick the 5 best ones and develops flexibility with the way you coach them, right? Or something like that, and not be paying a whole extra player salary for that. It's not the kind of the cost benefit on that isn't really quite right for most teams. For the prospect angle, it generally doesn't make sense to stash a prospect on your team as a 6th player because they're not playing during that time. They're not getting experience to help them improve. And that's the whole point of a prospect, is having them improve and become a starting player later. So they're not really getting that chance unless you go the EG approach and have a full second 5-player roster, which is now you're really ballooning the cost, and you have to make sure that you're willing to carry that. They're not playing, and they also have to be 18 years old to be a legitimate VCT sub. You're not putting a 16 or 17-year-old player in your 6th slot as a prospect because they can't play. They can be a reserve player or whatever the official name was for that, but they can't be your actual 6th player because they have to be allowed to play at the moment you want to sub them in. And if they're not 18 years old, they can't be subbed in. And many of the best prospects out there are 17 or even 16. So that prospect angle doesn't really work. So all 3 of those main use cases, kind of insurance, flexibility, prospects, they didn't really fit what teams wanted or needed. And so teams would often end up just putting a coach or an analyst into that slot to fulfill the requirement of covering for an emergency, but not be forced to kind of spend more money than they felt comfortable spending. So how does this change help with all those things? Well, it makes that slot of having, it makes that insurance for emergencies much more viable for a few different reasons. One is that, signing prospects, still it has to be 18-year-old prospects, but that actually makes sense now because the players can be in your org and have a contract with your org. So you're kind of like, you've got control of them in a sense. But they're still playing. They're able to get that experience. They're able to improve. They're able to receive active coaching and be scrimming and all of these things. And they're just doing it at the challengers level. But you're still then, contractually in a relationship with them. So they're your prospect. So that's huge. Now that prospects option actually opens up as long as they are 18 plus, right? So it still doesn't cover that young prospects angle. It also helps with the challenger side, which is something I haven't really talked about. But on the challenger side, orgs are trying to justify the cost of paying these players to be on a roster, where the only big payout is if you win Ascension, get promoted, now you get the payout of being in the Tier 1 scene. But if you are able to make a relationship with a VCT org and field 1 or 2 of their players, or however this works, and those players are being paid for by the VCT org, now as a challenger team, you're dropping your costs by 20%, 40% on the player salary front, which is huge for them financially. So it opens up options on how to use the 6th slot for a VCT team. It potentially saves challenger orgs money. Very beneficial, both of those things. And that's why I think this is a really good change. Details TBD, and we'll see how the orgs actually use them. What they, some of the orgs still see the strategic flexibility as worthwhile. All these different things. Some of them might think it's not worth having the challenger relationship. I don't know. We'll see how other people interpret this, but there are also, a couple of things that this doesn't solve for, and I think it's worth just being clear on that. Why I don't think this is a perfect policy or, a cure-all for a lot of these different things that are not perfect about the current format. This move does not save. It doesn't really save VCT orgs money, right? They're still going to be saving more money if they use a coach or an analyst as their 6th, because if they have to have, let's say they have 2 coaches, 5 starters, and a 6th who is playing in challengers, that's still more expensive than having 2 coaches and 5 starters, and one of those coaches is labeled as your sub. So it doesn't save VC2 orgs money. It just gives them more options on how to spend their money, assuming that they have the money and want to spend it. And also, as I've kind of mentioned, you still can't use most of the prospects that you're really excited about as your sixth because they're going to be under 18 if you're looking at some of these players who aren't age eligible yet. And getting kind of contractual control of these really young players, the 16, 17-year-olds, is one of the really exciting things about challengers, but that still won't help. This policy doesn't help with that at all, other than the fact that they can be signed and playing still. And that was still, I mean, it wasn't technically possible before, and I guess that's possible now, but it doesn't solve, you're still going to be spending money for that. It just creates more opportunities for the VC2 orgs to spend money if they have it and want to spend it. So that covers why, in general, I think this is a good policy change that's going to be good for the finances of challengers. It's going to be good for VCT orgs who want to be able to develop prospects and still allow them to play in challengers. But I don't think it's going to actually solve what I see as the biggest problem right now, which is just the financial sustainability of VCT teams and them trying to find that kind of point to break even or start generating profit. Overall, I think this will help the scene. Looking forward to seeing some of those details and how teams end up actually working within that system. And I hope it will create a lot more excitement for challengers, more reasons to watch it, and more opportunities for teams to work with young players and bring them into the scene over time. Thanks for watching.